The courtroom was supposed to be predictable, until the judge leaned forward, delivered a ruling no one expected, and the entire room gasped in disbelief. The day began like any other trial, with reporters shuffling into the gallery, pens ready, cameras flashing outside the courthouse doors. It was one of those high-profile cases that had drawn not only the press, but also the eyes of the public, glued to live streams and updates. Everyone thought they knew how this hearing would unfold. The arguments had been repetitive, the lawyers confident, the evidence seemingly obvious, and the judge, known for being cautious by the book, the kind who rarely deviated from precedent. That predictability is why this moment would become unforgettable. As the room settled, the defendant adjusted his tie nervously, his legal team whispering in his ear, rehearsing for what they thought was the final push in their favor. Across the aisle, the prosecution sat tall, files stacked neatly, prepared to argue point by point. Their strategy had been clear from the start: play it safe, highlight the flaws in the defense's claims, and let the law do the rest. But what no one realized was that the law, like the truth, has its sharp edges. And in just a matter of hours, those edges would cut through the courtroom air like a blade. The judge entered. The bailiff's call echoed. "All rise." Chairs scraped against the floor as the gallery stood. The air was heavy, but calm. Everyone assumed this was routine. After all, rulings in cases like this often felt procedural, even predictable. But not today. The arguments resumed, each side volleying back and forth. The defense leaned heavily on precedent, quoting cases that seemed to support their narrative. The lead attorney smirked as he delivered his lines, convinced he had cornered the opposition. He gestured to the jury, then to the bench, his voice rising with confidence. "Your Honor, as the record clearly shows, there is no legal ground for the claims being presented here today." His tone suggested finality. He was already imagining the headlines. But the judge didn't nod, didn't scribble notes. Instead, the judge's eyes lingered, watching, waiting, almost as though weighing something far heavier than the lawyers realized. Then came the prosecution's turn. Their approach was quieter, more methodical. No theatrics, just facts, dates, inconsistencies carefully layered one atop another. The gallery listened, half bored, expecting another day of legal back and forth, until one phrase stopped everything. "Your Honor, the defense would have you believe precedent protects them. But what happens when precedent is built on a foundation that was flawed from the very beginning?" Gasps, murmurs. Even the defendant's smirk faltered. The room shifted. That was the first crack, the first sign that this case wasn't as clean-cut as everyone assumed. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Every word suddenly mattered. Every pause amplified. At that moment, the gallery realized this wasn't going to be the ruling they expected. This wasn't going to be routine. And then the judge spoke. Slowly, deliberately. Words that would soon echo far beyond the walls of that courthouse. "I have reviewed the arguments. I have considered the evidence, and I find myself asking not just what precedent demands, but what justice requires." A hush. The phrase hung in the air like thunder after lightning, because everyone knew. When a judge says those words, something monumental is about to happen. The defense team's faces stiffened. They whispered furiously, flipping through their notes. They had prepared for legal citations, technicalities, but not for this. Not for a ruling that looked beyond procedure, that sought something deeper. The prosecution, meanwhile, sat frozen, wide-eyed. They had hoped for victory, yes, but not this. Not a turning of the tide so dramatic it would leave the entire room gasping. And here's the thing about moments like this. They ripple. Not just through the courtroom, but through every television screen, every news ticker, every whispered conversation outside. A ruling like this could set the stage for history. But what exactly did the judge say next? That's where the shock truly begins. The silence after the judge's opening words stretched longer than anyone in the room could stand. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed louder, filling the gap where words should have been. All eyes stayed fixed on the bench, waiting. Some leaned forward in their seats, others held their breath. It was as though the courtroom itself had frozen in anticipation of what was about to come. Then, With a slow inhale, the judge began to speak again. "For weeks now," he said, his voice calm yet firm, "we have been presented with arguments crafted for precision, shaped by precedent, and delivered with the polish of performance. But behind all of that, behind the motions, the citations, and the theatrics, lies a very simple question. Are we here to preserve appearances, or are we here to pursue justice?" The gallery reacted instantly. A murmur swept the room. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across their notepads. Some even glanced at each other with widened eyes, silently confirming, "Did he really just say that?" The defense attorney shifted in his chair, his confidence shaken. He had walked in ready to crush the prosecution with precedent, to remind the judge of established law at every turn. But this was dangerous. If the judge was willing to sidestep precedent in pursuit of justice, then the ground beneath his feet was no longer stable. "Your Honor," the defense lawyer interjected, standing abruptly, "with the utmost respect, our legal system is built on precedent. To disregard it—" The judge raised a hand. "Counselor, I did not say we would disregard precedent. I said we would not allow precedent to disguise injustice." A collective gasp. Even the stenographer, whose job was to stay stone-faced and detached, blinked at the sharpness of that line. The defendant leaned forward, whispering frantically to his team. His earlier smirk had evaporated, replaced with tension etched across his face. He had assumed this was his day, his victory secured by technicalities, by the clever weaving of legal history into a shield. But now that shield was beginning to crack. The prosecution sat motionless, stunned. They had argued hard, yes, but they had never dared hope for such a decisive tilt in their favor. To hear the judge openly question the fairness of precedent was something extraordinary, almost unheard of. The judge continued, "We must never forget that precedent itself was once a decision, a choice, a moment when someone in this seat weighed arguments and declared the path forward. But choices can be flawed, decisions can be clouded, and when those flaws repeat across generations, they grow roots too deep for us to see, unless we are willing to dig." The words carried weight beyond the walls. It was no longer just about this defendant or this case. It was about the very foundation of justice itself. Reporters sensed it instantly. This ruling, whatever it would be quoted in textbooks, debated in classrooms, replayed on television. But the real shock was still to come. The judge leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "In light of what has been presented, this court cannot and will not allow technicality to triumph over truth." And so, every heart in the room skipped. The defense attorney paled, gripping the edge of the table. The prosecution froze, afraid to even blink. The judge paused. That pause stretched, cruelly long, amplifying the tension. People in the gallery clutched the arms of their chairs. The room was no longer just a courtroom. It was a theater of suspense, every audience member hanging on the next word. "And so," the judge repeated, "this court rules." The words that followed landed like a thunderclap. The ruling shattered the defense's strategy, undercutting every smug argument, every careful citation. It was a reversal so unexpected that even seasoned reporters gasped audibly. Some attendees clapped a hand over their mouth. Others whispered, "Oh my God." The defendant slumped back, stunned, while his attorney scrambled to object, his voice cracking with desperation. "Your Honor, this is unprecedented." The judge didn't flinch. "Perhaps, but so was the truth you sought to bury. This ruling stands." The gavel struck once, the sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Chaos erupted. Voices rose all at once, reporters shouting questions, lawyers shouting objections, spectators whispering furiously. Bailiffs had to step forward, commanding order. But the order was gone. The room had already been transformed. In that instant, the trial was no longer just a case. It was a story of arrogance undone, of justice clawing its way to the surface, of a judge who refused to be predictable. Outside the courthouse, the ripple began. Phones buzzed. Clips of the ruling shot across social media within minutes. Hashtags trended. Commentators filled the airwaves. "Did you hear what the judge just said? This changes everything. No one saw this coming." The ruling was dissected, analyzed, and debated before the echoes of the gavel had even faded from the courtroom. Some hailed the judge as a hero, a defender of justice over bureaucracy. Others accused him of overreach, of destabilizing the system. But no one denied the power of the moment. And inside the courthouse, the stunned silence of the defense lingered, a reminder that confidence can crumble in seconds. The judge gathered his papers calmly, as though nothing extraordinary had happened, and exited the bench. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." Chairs scraped again, but this time the sound was hollow, mechanical. Everyone knew they had just witnessed history. But here's the thing about history. It doesn't end in the courtroom. It spreads, it mutates, it sets fire to conversations across the nation. And what followed this ruling would prove just as explosive as the moment it was delivered. The courthouse steps were always a theater after a major ruling, but on this day, it felt more like a stage set for a revolution. Reporters swarmed the exit doors, microphones ready, cameras aimed like weapons. Protesters and supporters alike gathered outside, chanting, holding signs, their voices carrying into the evening air. And then, the doors opened. The defense attorney was the first to emerge, face pale, tie loosened. He pushed past reporters muttering, "No comment," but his trembling hands told a different story. He had walked into the trial with swagger, certain his case was unshakable. But now, the ruling had ripped the ground from under him. His words would not matter anymore. His silence spoke louder. Moments later, the prosecution appeared. Unlike the defense, they did not rush. They stepped onto the courthouse steps with measured calm, their eyes scanning the sea of cameras. Reporters pounced instantly. "Did you expect the judge to rule this way? Do you believe this sets a new precedent? What message does this send to the nation?" The prosecutor's response was short, deliberate. Today, justice stood taller than technicality, that is all. The quote was gold. Within minutes, it plastered across every major news network. Commentators dissected it, some praising its gravity, others calling it too vague. But one thing was clear. The narrative had shifted. The ruling wasn't just a legal decision. It was a cultural earthquake. Social media erupted in real time. Clips of the judge's words, "We will not allow precedent to disguise injustice," were replayed on loop. Hashtags like "near justice over precedent" and "ear courtroom shock" dominated feeds. Memes flooded timelines, some mocking the defense attorney's stunned face, others turning the judge into a folk hero with captions like, "When you tell the truth and drop the gavel." Late-night comedians seized the moment. By evening, monologues opened with lines like, "That courtroom today had more drama than half the shows on television, and it was free." Laughter roared from studio audiences, but underneath the humor lay a serious truth. The entire nation was now watching, now debating, now polarized. Inside quiet homes, families sat around televisions, arguing passionately. Some insisted the judge had overstepped, rewriting the law to suit his own views. Others declared it was about time a judge put fairness above rigid rules. At dinner tables, in bars, in offices, the same words echoed. "Did you hear what the judge said?" And then came the ripple effect. Law schools across the country held emergency forums. Professors and students debated the implications. Was this the dawn of a new era in judicial interpretation, or was it a dangerous path toward instability? Scholars split, but all agreed. This ruling would be studied for years to come. Political figures weighed in too. Some hailed the judge as a defender of the people. Others condemned him as a loose cannon threatening the rule of law. Senators gave fiery speeches on the floor, pundits clashed on live television, and op-eds flooded newspapers. The story was no longer about one courtroom. It was about the soul of justice itself. Meanwhile, the defendant remained hidden, shielded by lawyers and PR advisors. His silence fueled speculation. Was he shocked, defiant, regretful? No one knew. What everyone did know was that his carefully crafted image had shattered the moment the judge struck the gavel. But what made this moment endure wasn't just the fallout in legal circles or political arenas. It was the emotional resonance with ordinary people. A mother in Ohio posted, "Today I told my kids that sometimes rules are used against us, but justice finds a way." We watched that judge, and we all cheered. A veteran in Texas wrote, "I've seen injustice buried under paperwork my whole life. Today I saw a judge dig it up." A student tweeted, "If justice can roar like that in a courtroom, maybe it can roar anywhere." It was more than law. It was inspiration. But inspiration is never unanimous. The backlash was fierce. Critics accused the judge of playing to the crowd, of undermining centuries of legal tradition. Think tanks published scathing reports. Headlines screamed warnings, judicial overreach at its worst. On talk radio, callers raged that the judge had spit on the Constitution. Yet for every critic, there was a supporter. For every voice of doubt, there was a voice of hope. And that clash, the collision of outrage and admiration, kept the story alive day after day. Soon, rallies formed. Some gathered to demand limits on judicial power, waving signs that read, "Rules over rulings." Others marched to celebrate the decision, their banners declaring, "Truth before tradition." The country was split, but it was awake. And through it all, the judge stayed silent. No interviews, no statements, no clarifications. Only the words spoken in that courtroom remained. And perhaps that silence was the loudest statement of all, that he had said what needed to be said, and nothing more. The image of that day, the gavel striking, the gasp of the crowd, the stunned faces, continued to replay in the minds of millions. It became one of those rare cultural snapshots, like a photograph burned into memory. And yet the real question lingered in the air: what happens next? Because rulings have consequences. Precedents shape futures. And while one courtroom had erupted in shock, the real test was still ahead. Would this ruling stand the test of appeals? Would it ripple through future cases? Would it truly change how justice was done in America? The answer wasn't clear yet. But one thing was undeniable. No one who watched that ruling unfold would ever forget the sound of the gavel, the sight of the stunned defense, and the words that carried far beyond the courtroom walls. And as commentators repeated endlessly, it wasn't just the ruling, it was the gasp that followed. The world held its breath, waiting for the next chapter. But what came after would push the story from extraordinary to unforgettable. Because history does not end with a ruling, it begins there. So if this moment shook you, if it made you believe that truth can roar even in the most unlikely of places, do not let it fade. Share this story. Subscribe for more courtroom showdowns, political battles, and moments where arrogance collapses under the weight of justice. Because in the end, history is not just told, it is remembered by those who choose to keep it alive.